Good morning. Just took over the environmental beat for the Houston Chronicle. Before that, I had spent about 10 years covering immigration in Texas, Tennessee, and abroad. And I'll start with, I'll start with the video that PBS did an interview with me last year, I think, and I think it summarizes a lot of who I am. And after that, I do want to address the question about bias, because being an immigrant and a Hispanic journalist covering immigration in the Southeast, that was something that readers and sources question a lot, and something that I have spent a lot of time thinking about through my career, so I do want to address that. But we'll start with this. So sorry about the technical difficulties, I guess. So as I was saying, I had been covering immigration for about 10 years. The last place was in Arizona in the border, and so this project that I'm going to talk about later on is specifically about immigration, and more recently I shifted over to the environment, which is related to what Amy was talking about. But the project that I want to talk about, and we'll see some slides right now, it's about the family migration. That's something that you're probably hearing a lot about, seeing on the news. And it was important for me to, covering the border, covering immigration in Tennessee, it was important for me to go to the places where this was actually happening because I think it's important for us as reporter, but also as the community, to connect with these issues that sometimes seem so far away that, how does this relate to me if it's happening in South America, if it's happening in Europe? And I think what I've learned through all these reporting projects is that everything is so interconnected. So the same issues that I would hear about from, for example, I'm talking to Arizona ranchers, and the fear of Islamization and Sharia law, and the us versus them was the same fears of Greek businessmen in Lesbos, talking about the refugee situation there, or talking about activists, talking to activists, the feelings of Frontex, which is the equivalent of the Border Patrol in Europe, was the same feelings that I was hearing from activists about the Border Patrol. So I think oftentimes we tend to think of issues as regional or only pertaining to us, but everything is connected and everything has a global aspect to it. So I'll start now, hopefully, playing. So PBS did an interview. They have a quick show called Brief But Spectacular, and they had done, kind of like famous people, and they were trying to focus also on local journalists to bring more attention to local news, because as we all know, local news is struggling at the moment. And I had done a story a few years ago in collaboration with a radio reporter on a family whose mom, so it was 4 siblings, all born in the US. The mom had been in the US illegally and had been barred from returning for 10 years. And so it was a story about how these 4 siblings had basically coped of being raised. The dad was much older than the mom, so he was an elderly parent. And so the story was about how these 4 siblings had come together and built a network of support around them that made them excel. So one of them enlisted in the military and became a Marine. Another one got a full scholarship and now is in Oxford getting his 2nd master's. I think he's about to be done. And so they reached out to me to do a story about this family, and then also to do a story about the reporter, one of the reporters behind that. I once had a mentor who said, you write for the skeptical reader. And it doesn't mean that you're going to convince them at the end of the story, but you want them to read through the end. I was born in Juarez, Mexico, and grew up across the border in El Paso, Texas. Being from a border community, you just go back from one place to the other. You speak both languages, you learn to appreciate all kinds of food, and you create a different culture. Especially when you're reporting on global issues, it's very easy to say, well, why should I care? With border reporting or immigration reporting, if you're able to connect people to people, it doesn't matter if they're your neighbor or someone who lives across the ocean from you, you're going to be able to relate on a human level. And I think that's what I really try to do with my stories. A few years ago, we wanted to do a story about family separation, what happens when a parent is deported, and what happens to the children left behind. The De La Rosa family is a set of 4 siblings whose mother was barred from coming back to the U.S. for 10 years because she had been in the country illegally before. You had a little girl who from the age of 12 learned to be the mom and the caretaker of the house. There's a lot of research that show that, especially after a deportation, there's a lot of instability in the household, both financially and emotionally. But with the De La Rosa siblings, what we learn is that they built themselves this network of support. They were not afraid to ask for help. As local reporters, it's always a challenge of too few resources. There's always a lot more stories that need to be told that I can tell by myself. And you see other publications and you maybe have 5 different names in a byline and you're scrambling. And so you're competing, for example, to tell the same stories of these families or these people. But if you're an organization that has limited resources, are you going to give the story to the New York Times or to the Arizona Daily Star? And I think that's where you have to figure out what's not being covered. What are others not doing that I can do better because I've lived here and I've covered this community for many more years instead of trying to chase the same thing that everyone else is doing. My name is Perla Trevizo, and this is my brief but spectacular take on covering the Arizona border. So I think that's a good summary of what I try to do with my report. Thank you. And so I actually started covering immigration full-time in Tennessee. It's what's called one of those new destination states. So traditionally, migrants have gone to states like Texas or California. But over the years, as jobs shifted to other parts of the country, places like Tennessee, Georgia, the Carolinas started seeing more migration. And what does that mean? That all of a sudden, neighborhoods where English was the main language spoken or that look a certain way started shifting, and that brings a lot of, if you lived in your same neighborhood for 40 years and all of a sudden it's changing, we all react to change in different ways, right? And so going to the bias thing, so I had a lot of readers. I was the only Hispanic journalist in the newspaper. I was covering immigration. I have a name such as Perla Trevizo. I look a certain way. And so readers start emailing me and sending letters. And the whole issue of bias was a big concern for them. They were wondering if someone like me could report on immigration fairly and accurately. And I once had a state lawmaker who not only called me pretty lady, which is completely inappropriate, but also, after the interview, he's like, oh, you know what, I thought you were gonna be a lot more unfair because my assistant had told me who I was. And the implication was that by being Hispanic and by being an immigrant, I could not conduct a fair interview, and it was about a immigration-related law. And so I've always strived very, very hard to, and I think you even hold yourself to a different level of accountability because of that. You're always kind of trying to fight for people to see you as a fair and balanced and objective reporter. As I say there, I'm not trying to tell people what to think, but to provide the information so they make their own informed decisions. And I think it's hard, and you have to keep yourself in check all the time. But I've had stories where I've had Border Patrol agents and activists both tell me that thank you for doing a fair job, or thank you for doing a balanced story. And balance doesn't mean just quoting both sides equally, or if there's one person that says this, you have to find someone who says the opposite, but to really provide the analysis and the context, and not just quote people for the sake of quoting people. So I've been fortunate, even though I've been a local news reporter for all of my career, to have organizations such as the Pulitzer Center support my reporting trips. So I've been able to done reporting projects in Guatemala twice. I've done reporting projects in Africa twice. I was recently spent a year in Germany, where I reported also on the refugee situation there from Greece, Italy, and Germany. And as I was saying when we were having our technical difficulties, there's a lot of commonalities of the issues we face. And I think the more we talk to each other, both from the journalism side, the teacher side, the community side, we can start coming together with solutions or ways to address the issues that we're as a global society facing, because the fears of people coming in and the job aspect, the economy, the crime, the different religions, the different languages, are people integrating or not? Those are not only conversations that are happening here, but are conversations that are happening all over the world. And I think if we have, on the reporting side, if we come up with ways that we can better tell the story, on the teacher side, ways to communicate with our students, on the community side and political side, I think we can learn from each other much more than what we think. So as I was mentioning before, I had been writing about these issues for a long time. I had talking to local people, lawmakers, following the policies from Washington, the legislatures from the state. But part of me was feeling that I can talk to the people all I want to hear, but I want to better understand what's going on in the home countries. Why are more people coming? Why are they coming alone? Why are they coming with their kids? What's the situation like in their home countries, to help me better understand what's going on so I can explain it to my readers. If I don't understand it, how do I expect to be able to translate this to my community? And so I really wanted to see, explore the why, remember the context and historical issues that have happened there, and kind of, not everyone can travel to some of the places we travel, so we hope to be those ears and eyes and represent those voices, so then readers back home who don't have those same opportunities can learn about it. So I first, being in Tennessee, I first went to Guatemala in 2010, 2011. Towards the end of the Bush administration, there was a series of raids in companies. I don't know how many of you remember, but so basically one of the immigration enforcement strategies was to go after companies that hire the unauthorized population and conduct raids. And so in Chattanooga, Tennessee, the poultry plants are very big, and a lot of them have attracted over the years more immigrant workers. And so there was a raid where 100 people were arrested, and I was able to follow that process. But then I wanted to know what happens after they go back. What happens after the deportation? What happens to these families? And I ended up meeting that little girl. Her name is Jennifer, which now she must be 18 or something. And she had been born in Chattanooga, Tennessee, but the mom had decided to go back to Guatemala because she saw it as very difficult to continue working without authorization in the U.S., so she decided to go back. And I met her a year or two after she had gone back, and I brought letters from her classmates and pictures, and she looked so different from the pictures they had shown me. All of a sudden, as you see, her hair was matted, she had lost a ton of weight, she had skin problems, she was losing the English that she had learned here. And so it was very interesting to see what happens to children after they go back, and whether, regardless of the political position, that this was just the fact of one single family and one little girl, and the teachers and the classmates, and they were all missing her and talking about her. And so I did a series focusing on those issues, talking about employment. I mean, all of it starts with jobs. A lot of these people were working in the poultry plants, or were working in the agriculture. And so it was kind of letting our readers know, these are the people that you're seeing in your neighborhoods. These are the people that you're seeing in your schools. These are their background stories. This is what's going on in the political spectrum, and this is how it all relates. Then fast forward to 2014, that's when we first started to see the increase of families arriving at the U.S. border. At that time, it was a much smaller number than what we're seeing today, but it was very similar. You were seeing more unaccompanied minors and more families, so that's basically a parent traveling with a child. And so we first started hearing about it because they were being dropped off at the local bus station. And so all of a sudden, the Greyhound was calling people, was like, why are we having so many people at our bus station who don't know where they're going? They have no money, they have no cell phone, like, what do we do with them? And so churches and nonprofit organizations started volunteering at the bus station, bringing them food and snacks and blankets, and kind of helping them connect with their relatives to go to where they're going. And I was able to find a mom who allowed me to go with her on the bus journey to Delaware and kind of learn a little bit more about this family. And what was surprising is that her father had migrated to the U.S. when they were kids, so he missed all of their childhood, with the idea to provide his kids with a better education so they wouldn't have to do what he did. And both her and her brother became teachers or graduated with a teaching degree, but they couldn't find a job. And so then her brother left, and a year later she left with her kids. So now the parents are back in Guatemala, and the kids are living in the U.S. without authorization, in the shadows, just as he was, and they weren't able to break that cycle. So fast forward to the project that I did related to the Pulitzer Center, we continue to see the larger numbers of people arriving. There was a lot more coverage around it. And ever since 2014, I had wanted to go back to Guatemala and report on the conditions in the home country, but we hadn't had the resources. And so I was able to do it earlier this year. And I had a little explainer video to help summarize the situation. More than 720,000 families and minors traveling alone have turned themselves into Border Patrol agents along the southwest border since October 2016. Over 110,000 others have presented themselves at ports of entry in just the last 2 years, and about 40% of them are from Guatemala, the biggest single group. The pool is so strong that not even the death of 8-year-old Felipe Gomez Alonso, who died in Border Patrol custody on Christmas Eve, has deterred others from coming. That includes his uncle and cousin, who have left the isolated village of Yalambohoj, about 11 hours from the capital. That's where Felipe was from. Some flee gangs, violent partners, or cartels. For others, it's poverty and an idea of what life can be like in the United States. Guatemala has one of the worst income inequalities in the hemisphere. About 51% of the population live in poverty. 76% for indigenous communities such as the ones in Huehuetenango, where many of those arriving in Arizona come from. 1 out of every 2 children under the age of 5 are chronically malnourished, and it's even higher in the Western Highlands. The rural indigenous population was greatly impacted by a 36-year armed conflict that claimed more than 200,000 lives. That's more than in similar conflicts in El Salvador, Nicaragua, Chile, and Argentina combined. And many are still reeling from the effects. In a place like this, entire families fled to Mexico during the conflict. Then they only came back to migrate again, this time to the U.S. in the late 1990s after recruiters arrived offering them jobs in chicken plants and farms in the southeast. Now parents leave with their children in tow. It's a new migration trend in part driven by a cycle of debt, money borrowed for day-to-day living or thousands to pay for the journey north. While many Guatemalans in this region work in the coffee fields, that only pays $6 a day, and only for the season. Once someone leaves and is deported, they see no other way to repay the thousands of dollars borrowed but to keep trying until they make it. So more school desks sit empty. A middle school classroom in Buleg has only 4 students, all girls. The rest have either dropped out of school because they can't afford it or left for the United States. Families hear that if you come to the U.S. with a child and turn yourself in, you can stay. They don't have to walk for days in the desert, risking death. So they leave, and they will continue to leave as long as they remain hopeless. Life in their native Guatemala will change. So basically, that's a summary of the project I ended up doing, and I didn't know where I was going to go. Also working with less resources, you don't have all the resources in the home country to work with, but I found a photographer who agreed to work with me from a local Guatemalan publication. And we ended up by coincidence in this town where this little boy had died. He was one of the first unaccompanied migrant boys who died in custody. And what was very surprising is that, you would think after families hear of a little boy dying that they would rethink, or they would think twice before embarking on that journey. And it was surprising to hear it had essentially no impact whatsoever. Family, every week there was even an announcement, and I just missed it, but there was an announcement in the town speaker from the smugglers essentially saying, I'm going to be around town today. You can call this number, this for more information, and we leave X day. And I think one of the reasons, and I touch on in this video, is that we nothing happens in a vacuum, right? We need to remember that all of this is connected, and in a place like Guatemala, which is the as I mentioned, they're the largest group right now, they did go through this very violent civil war. And the indigenous communities that we see migrating today are the same communities that were impacted the most by that conflict. And the role that more developed countries such as the US has played in those countries, because I think one of the questions that comes out from this is, why should we care? Why should we play a role in this? Like, we have our own problems. We have our own people without jobs. We have our own homeless population. Why should we be caring about what's happening in another country? We should care about our own first. And I think that that's absolutely valid questions. And what you find through the reporting is a couple of things. So one, the conflict and the role that the U.S. plays in the initial conflict, and the impact that that is still having on these populations that haven't fully recovered. Second, you have the employment demand. So back in the 80s and 90s, when there was more organizing and unionizing, recruiters traveled to these towns and asked for people to come work. And so then you start having, I met the man from the town, the first man who actually traveled, migrated to the U.S. to work in South Carolina. And that starts forming that little chain, right? So then you call back and you say, I'm making $500 a week, when you're not going to be able to make close to that money in your home country. And so then another person leaves. And then you start having, the whole town, like they start building concrete homes, and they're from the remittances, the money that's sent back, and all of a sudden your neighbor has a nice concrete home, and you're still with dirt floors and no water. And so then you're like, well, I want the opportunities that other guy has, and he's providing for his family, and I'm not providing for my family. And so then they start leaving more and more. And so initially we had more of a cyclical migration. Migrants would travel to the U.S., work, go back, travel, go back. But as enforcement got tougher, the government decided to start punishing people for crossing the border illegally, either prosecuting them criminally, or they have a whole system of consequences that they established. So then people started staying because it was too risky to come back and forth, because now they knew that if they crossed again, the government could punish them by including jail. So then you had the men start calling for the women. And so then now you not only had the men in places like South Carolina or Chattanooga, Tennessee, but you also had the moms joining and the kids being left behind with the grandparents. And so now what we're seeing is this new cycle of migration where it involves the kid. And I think it's going to be very interesting for us to keep following up on this issue and see what impact does that have. Because I think if you're having kids who are 4 or 5 years old coming to the U.S. at that young age, and because there's such a backlog of immigration cases, and then the system is not functioning correctly, what's going to happen to those kids, and what's the impact in the home countries of so many kids leaving. So this is the area where I travel, and it's called the Western Highlands of Guatemala. It was amazing to see how similar to the Southeast was, and I can only imagine for those who have migrated to the Carolinas, because it's surrounded by this beautiful green hills with forests, and there's like crystalline water. So for any of us, it's like, why would you want to leave this place? It's beautiful, it's quiet. But of course, visiting there and being a foreigner there is very different than actually making a livelihood there. But it's a very pretty place. And so I met kids like Candelaria. So she's 15. As you see, like everyone was very, very small. And I think that's part of the chronic malnourishment issues that they have. And because she's 15, but she looked more, like 11 or 12, and she was very witty and smart. And she had dropped out of school after 6th grade, I think. And what I was told there's a Swedish organization that runs a community center and offers early childhood development courses, and I think they also had a middle school program, but they ended up closing because most students had left for the U.S. And so she had to drop out of school after 6th grade, but they remember her for being like 4 or 5 and memorizing this whole speech about a civil conflict that they had in Guatemala and reciting it in front of all this Swedish and other foreign attendees. And she couldn't keep going to school, and she was the most, funny and hopeful, and just, I have a soft spot for kids generally. But she was a very nice little girl, and I guess teenager now, but she ended up having, so her stepdad ended up migrating to the US with her younger sister, so she had to step in, and she would wake up at 5-something in the morning, get the corn that she had soaked the night before, go grind it, make sure she had made the tortillas and breakfast for her mom and siblings before 7 in the morning. The jobs that the stepdad used to do, like going to tending the fields, now the mom was doing it, so then she was in charge of caring for the younger kids. And so the consequence of the migration that we're seeing is not only on the people who are actually coming, but also on those who stay behind, all of a sudden have a lot more responsibility than they did before. And it was interesting when I would ask them, what did you want to be? Like, if you could continue school, what would you have wanted to be? And while some did have, I would want to be an agricultural engineer or maybe a doctor, a lot of them, they just like, there's no point in even thinking or answering that question because I knew it wouldn't be a possibility. And I think that obviously speaks to the problems in that country, the government, the issues that the government has, but I think it affects us all because of what we're seeing here, but also the conditions that remain in the country. And this is Pascual, and so with his story, so I had always heard the whole issue of debt that I also mentioned in the video, that for a lot of these families, in order to make the trip here, they have to go in debt because they don't have $10,000. And so they either borrow the money from relatives already here, or some of them use their homes or whatever they have as a collateral, meaning that if they can't repay that money, they will be much worse off than when they left. So if they had a little house or a little plot of land that the grandparents had left them, they run the risk of losing that. And so while I had heard about this, I did not realize how big of a role it's playing in the migration that we see today. So Pascual, for example, his dad had first tried to migrate to the US, but this was after there were more Border Patrol agents, more enforcement, more consequences, so he never made it. And what did that mean is that the family then was in debt for $15,000 or so. So then Pascual decided to leave to help out his family, and so he did make it as an unaccompanied minor. But eventually, he says that the attorney did not do his job or whatever happened, he ended up being deported before he could repay that money. So now this family they also have several children. I think it was 5 or 6 or so. Not only are they still in the poverty situation that they were trying to flee, but now they owe close to $20,000, which, earning $600 a day farming, it's not going to take you, it's not going to take you very far. And so what happens? Pascual's younger brother ends up leaving as an unaccompanied minor with his dad again. And so now the dad and the brother are here in the U.S., and I'm not sure what their current legal situation is, but that kind of just shows that, yes, we're seeing all these people come, but why, how do you address that? And I think those are the questions that we need to be having. If once you owe $20,000 as a family and you you risk losing whatever bit you have left, what do you do as a parent? What do you do as a father, as a mother? And I do not have the answer to that, but I do think those are questions that we need to think about. This is the classroom that I mentioned in the video. So the little boy had just left with his dad, and the teachers were very concerned because in some cases the little boys and girls did not want to leave. And they did not want to go to the U.S., and the parents were taking them. And so it just also brings this whole discussion of the family dynamics and what that means for that family, and even more separation, not only separation that we hear about here, but also the separation that takes place in their country. And talking to human rights activists and advocates, they say migration should be a right. It's a human right, but it should really be a choice. You should not be forced to leave. And for a lot of these families, at least in the way they view it, it's they don't have a choice. It's something they have to do. This is the little boy that I was telling you about, and that I was very surprised to see how little of an impact it ended up having. And since then, we've only had more children pass away. And I think that's something, while border deaths, and here and also in the Mediterranean, we hear have been happening for some time, as the population of who migrates changes, we are going to see more children die, just simply because of the numbers that are coming and the situation. So while we've been reporting about migrant deaths for for more than, I guess would be 2 decades or so, I think now for the reporting and the community side, the conversations are going to be involving children and, what can be done about that, because they have no say in what's going on. And also with this family, when we got there a few months after he had died, now the uncle and another cousin had left. So not even in the broader town, it had not had an impact. It had not had an impact in his family. So as I mentioned, I had heard about the cycle of death, but there was another woman that I didn't picture here, but her husband had committed suicide because he owed so much money, and this was not related to migration. So then her daughter left, and we hear from immigration officials that, some migrants, when they arrive, they are usually they have an ankle bracelet to track them. So Immigration Customs Enforcement puts an ankle bracelet on them so they can track them until they present themselves before an officer, and that sometimes they cut it off and abscond. And so this family had an example of that, and the daughter of the woman had basically cut off her ankle bracelet, and that's obviously not the right thing to do. But when you sit down and talk to this family, so her husband had committed suicide because he owed so much money. Then the daughter had left. The daughter had left before the dad committed suicide. A few days later, she hears her dad kill himself, and now she thinks, I cannot be deported because not only am I going to owe the money that I borrowed to come, but how am I going to repay the debt that my dad had and that led to his death? And so then she had a son who left as well with his niece, and they got detained and separated at the border. So the woman was just very fearful that then the son would come back defeated as well and follow in the footsteps of the dad. And so I think these are, there are no easy answers. It's a highly emotional, highly political, but there's a lot, the stories are not black and white, right? There's a lot of gray in there, and the more time, it's easy to just have the quote in the story or the quick clip, but the more time you spend talking to these families, the more complexities you find. And I think as reporters, that is part of our job, to show you those complexities, for you to have all that information and again, make your own decisions. So part of the project, and I think there's a correlation of inequality and migration, and so we created an interactive map that you're welcome to go and play around with it. So we got several data points and kind of used it so you could see what were the departments or states that had the highest infant mortality rates, the highest malnutrition rates, where were the highest remittances, meaning the money was sent back. And I think you can start seeing a pattern of the Western Highlands, for example, or those states that are closest to the Mexico border that had the biggest numbers. So while it's important to have the national stories, I think local communities is where all this information is needed the most, not just in New York or in Washington, but the local communities, both where this is happening, for example, the border, and local communities where these families and migrants are arriving at. And so we published the work both in English and Spanish in Arizona. We also partner with the Guatemalan journalists, and we share the work so they could publish it in Guatemala as well. I reached out to the Post and Courier, so a lot of the people I was talking to had migrated to South Carolina, and so I figured their readers would be interested in learning about this, so they also published one of the stories. And I'll end with another video. So the whole question of why this matters, and I could talk to you more, but I think this explains it well. We have been writing about families migrating since at least 2014, and we wanted to be able to go to Guatemala, to some of the communities where the families are coming from, and show our readers what are some of the reasons that these families are migrating, mostly parents with their children or unaccompanied minors. We ended up going to the village of Yalambojosh, which is the community where Felipe was from. Felipe is one of the 2 kids who have died recently in custody after crossing the border with their parents. And his funeral was a month ago, and to my surprise, his death had not deterred anyone from migrating. A complex kind of set of reasons why people are fleeing or seeking to leave. In those particular communities where it was because people wanted to give their kids a better education, because they wanted a concrete home, because they wanted to buy a bigger plot of land to grow coffee or do subsistence farming or make sure their kids had a place to live when they grew. They had given up that Guatemala could provide what they needed to have a dignified way of life. It's a little early to know what that full impact will have, but what I did see is that you do have schools that are losing kids because they're going to the U.S. And a lot of times I was told by teachers, those who stay behind are starting to lose an interest in their education because they figure it's only a matter of time before they migrate. And on the children who stay, you do have more responsibilities once one of the two parents leaves, because then that means in the case of if the father is the one who leaves, the mom has to take on more responsibilities, especially initially when while the parent who migrates gets a job and starts sending money back. The pressure of having to go to the U.S., the feeling that you're not going to be able to make anything of yourself unless you migrate. Families start facing this cycle of debt that they accumulate while being in Guatemala, debt that they accumulate after paying smugglers to bring them to the U.S. And if they get deported, they owe $10,000, $12,000, and they make 50 quetzales a day, which is $5 or less. And so they see that coming back to the U.S. as the only way that they would ever be able to repay that money. That shows kind of even if people are leaving for economic reasons, kind of the gravity of the situation they're trying to leave behind, and how it gets even more complicated with the issue of debt. When you see all of your neighbors going to the U.S. and building their nice houses and coming back and buying cars and plots of land, I think the pressure becomes very real to follow along. It's not enough to just have national stories about what's going on in other parts of the world. I think we as individuals care more about a topic or a subject when we feel connected to that person or to that issue. And I think when we can connect to what we don't necessarily understand, it might inform us more or bring more understanding. And so with that, I just want to add one last thing. So I focus on Guatemala, and that region is very much the economic reasons. Again, not economic reasons as simple as they can't get a job and they just need a better job, but all the structural reasons that I mentioned, such as historic inequality against indigenous people, the effect of the Civil War, et cetera. But they are, the families that you hear about on TV, or that you hear, that you see hear on the radio, they are coming from different countries, and each region faces their own challenges. So we can't, just because I'm reporting about this specific area and these are the reasons families are fleeing, you do have gang violence, you do have domestic violence, you do have climate change, you have a whole wide array of issues. So I don't mean to oversimplify the issue. This is very specific to the place where I reported, but obviously people are coming from for many more reasons than that. So we'll open it up for questions.
Hi, you've mentioned $10,000 or $12,000 debt. Can you say who's loaning that money and what it covers?
So it's a combination. So you either have relatives who help you out with that who are already in the U.S. You have smugglers who say, you pay me X amount right now, and once you're in the U.S., you pay me the rest, or your family pays me the rest. You have banks that do loans. You have people in the community who might have someone in the U.S. and they start kind of a loan service. And again, this is where the problem comes, because you start using your house or your land as collateral, so the stakes are much higher. So not only are you worse off, but now you might not even have a house.
And what it covers? Could you talk about
what it covers? That? So it's basically the transportation. You have someone. It's a whole. The way the smuggling network works, it's a whole very organized network. So you have someone from your little village in Guatemala that takes you to the border with Mexico. They hand you off to someone else in the southern border of Mexico. Then from there, they have someone who transports you via bus or vans or other means to the U.S.-Mexico border, and then depending if you're a family or a single adult, they might have you in a safe house for a little bit, and then you might walk, if you're crossing through the Arizona desert, 8 days or nights through the desert. If you're a family, they just tell you to cross the line and wait for Border Patrol to get there. So it's the whole, and then once, if you are crossing without authorization, you're not a family unit turning yourself in, then there's the network that from the U.S. picks you up and takes you to places like North Carolina or Tennessee.
Thank you for your presentation. I wanted to connect your presentation to Amy Martin's in the sense that if we want to understand this process of migration as Americans, we have to look at the neo-colonial relationship between America and Guatemala. I mean, the Civil War began after the U.S. supported a coup d'etat against Arbenz, and that coup d'etat had to do with the fact that Arbenz had some reform projects that affected U.S. companies, such as United Fruit Company, something as simple as Americans and Europeans access to fruits, basically spurred this coup d'etat. And after 1954, U.S. supported one military government after the other. So that's part of the whole narrative, that each time we talk about some of these Central American countries, we have to emphasize. Other than that, it becomes very difficult for average American to understand why we are implicated in this narrative.
And I do have, if you do have let me see where, so I have the links to the stories here, and I did do 2 stories. One is the main one from Guatemala, and I do have a section of the historical context of the war, and another one is the unintended consequences of this paradox of enforcement that we're seeing today. So if you do have time to explore them, because I do, and that's why I emphasize, like, nothing happens in a vacuum. Everything's connected, and I think it's very easy to get caught on, why, they should take care of their own problems, but not only does it affect all of us, but also the role that more developed countries have had in some of these regions.
Maybe it's a little bit out of topic, but when you mentioned you were in Germany, reporting also migration, but when you showed the map, it was Tanzania.
No, there was, the map also showed little points in Europe.
No, yeah, but did you go to Africa to report
I
migration
did. I've done 2 reporting trips in Africa, and one of them, so I was back in Tennessee, we were having resettlement from Burundians, and it's called the 1972 Burundians because these were people who were displaced also during a conflict there, and you had multiple generations who had been born and raised in refugee camps. And so we were getting the resettlement of this population, and I wanted to bring a better understanding to the local community of who were their new neighbors, what were their backgrounds, and also what was the situation like for the families that were left behind. For example, you had an elderly couple whose children stayed behind in the refugee camp. You had a grandma, and I think you saw it in the picture as well from the PBS video, a grandma who had migrated with her grandson, but the mom and the other kids had stayed behind, and so I wanted to kind of bring those stories back to my local readers, and it shows again the long-term consequences of wars, that yes, just because a peace agreement was signed does not mean that everything is well and back to normal, quote unquote. So what I found in that reporting trip is that even though it was years, I think more than 10 years since the peace agreements had been signed, the country was still not quite prepared to receive its citizens. So I was there when they closed the last refugee camp for Burundians in Tanzania with the idea that it's time for you to go back home. And if you follow the news after that, there have been issues after that because it's, you don't recover all of a sudden, and you can't just take everyone back in and everything's going to be fine. It's a long-term and work in progress.
Yeah, my question is, maybe I missed what you said, but I don't understand how these people end up in debt in their own country before they try to come to the U.S. and have to pay smugglers. Could you enlarge on that?
For example, let's say you're a farmer, a subsistence farmer, have a small plot, and the rain has not been falling as you thought, or maybe there's coffee rust, and your plants are not growing as they should. And so you get a loan for fertilizers or some sort of pesticide to treat your crop, but then something happens and you lose the whole crop, and so you were not able to make any money of it. You also have alcoholism, or we're dealing with human beings, and there's a whole range of reasons, but for example, that's one. Others can be responsible management and all the other stuff that we would see here as well.
I just feel it's very upsetting, this news. And I'm wondering why journalists don't spend more time addressing what she talked about, which is why this is going on and who has the responsibility. Because we're allowing people like Trump and these corporations to paint this horrible picture of immigrants who are, coming here and creating havoc and whatever. And the reality is the U.S. created the problem in Central America as a whole. 1954, it's not a debate, and we don't need to be accused of being biased, but the CIA did overthrow a legitimately democratic elected government and installed a military one, which was responsible for the genocide of 200,000 people there, and whose president was sentenced to 80 years for war crimes that he committed. I guess if that happened in America, we'd be going to Guatemala or somewhere else too.
And I do feel that we do. It's just that there's so much coverage, and there's, especially with immigration right now, there's always something happening every single day or multiple times a day. And so I think it's very easy for the more in-depth or analysis to get lost in the news of the day. And I think that's a challenge that we face. And how do we, I think a fear, and not just of immigration reporting, but of reporting in general right now, is that it's very reactionary. So we're constantly reacting to what's being said, not being said, who talked to whom, what was tweeted, what was not tweeted, and we're dedicating a lot less time to being proactive and doing this kind of analysis. And it's a hard balance, because you do have to respond to the daily news, you do have less resources, and stories, this is not the first story I've done where I've actually talked about the in-depth and analysis of what's going on in Guatemala, but either they're longer stories, they're not the quick clips that you see on Facebook, they're not the tweets that you see. So it takes also a lot more commitment from the reader to actually spend the time reading the entire story, and not everyone has the time or to be frank, sometimes the interest. So I do think that this kind of reporting is being done is just being overshadowed by the quick news of the day.
I just have a question. Do you typically get assigned a story, or do you have to pitch an idea about something that you came up with?
Pitch an idea. So the way it works, especially with such big beats such as immigration, is that you do have to sometimes get asked to cover things if there's a press conference or something being done or said, but a lot of it has to come from you. I never lack story ideas. No, there's just so much to do that's not necessarily an issue, but I think it's a combination of both, but a lot of it is the initiative of the reporter and also what the editors allow you to do. So unlike some of the other speakers who are freelancers, I've always been a staff writer, and so there's pros and cons to that, right? I mean, you have a more secure job, although that's also quote unquote in today's world, but you do have to work with editors and get sometimes assigned stories that you might not necessarily feel it's a priority, but it's part of having that relationship with your editors and your news outlet, and hopefully they agree with you on what are the important stories to tell and give you the space. For example, for this last story, they gave me an entire section, which in the print world it's almost unheard of today, because paper is expensive and ink is expensive, but I was lucky to work for a place that actually valued this kind of writing, and we got a very good response from our readers, sending letters to the editors, thanking the newspaper for publishing this kind of work.
Hi, thank you again for your presentation. My question is kind of an extension to my colleagues. How much freedom of reporting do you have? And have you ever had to face censorship? So I just admire the work that all of you journalists do, because you really put your lives on the line, and it is a very dangerous job. So We owe you.
Well, thank you. No, I've been fortunate not to ever be censored. I have had to take some measures, for example, while reporting on, there's a town across the border from Arizona where it used to be a staging ground for migrants, the kind of the last stop before they walked into the desert, and it's controlled by the cartels. And so when reporting in places like that, I do try to connect with a local that can guide me and make sure that I'm not just a random journalist alone. They do know all of your whereabouts. They know where you're going, but I think as long as you're not walking by yourself at night or doing anything that's not common sense, you're technically be okay. One time I was reporting on the aftermath of this shootout as well, and I was going with a photographer, so I made sure to call the consulate before I led my contacts with the Customs and Border Protection, or I try to let people know where I was going, and ask them, is there any things that I should be mindful about? But compared to other journalists who have reported in much more hostile environments, I haven't had to worry about that. I was doing a workshop with journalists from Nicaragua and Honduras, and just to hear what they have to go through, and they're seeing their colleagues in prison, I think made me a lot more grateful. We do have our challenges here. We have our challenges with freedom of information. I'm not saying that everything is easy here, but compared to some of the things that journalists in other parts of the world are facing, I feel very grateful to be in the situation I am.
Great, and then, yeah.
I hope you don't mind my asking another question. I just wanted to go back to your earlier point about your being asked about your bias, which I find very interesting. Had you been a Euro-American, you wouldn't have had any bias?
It's
That's the assumption?
It's hard to tell. I think it clearly, some people, just by the way you look, make assumptions. So I'm not sure if my skin tone would have been different, if it would be the same, but I did have a lot more hate mail being written when I was working in Tennessee than in Arizona, for example. And when one anonymous letter was, I think that the harshest that I ever received, and it was after this Guatemala series, and the first one I mentioned, not this particular one, but the one I showed first from the little girl, and he basically said to go back to where I came from, meaning Guatemala, and to take the blacks with me. And so, and with calls like that, or I'm always willing to engage with whoever reaches out to me, as long as it's respectful, as long as it's criticism to my work, not to my personal self. And as long as it doesn't cross the line, I'm willing to take criticism, I'm willing to respond and go back and forth, to listen to their concerns, and take them into consideration for future reporting, because I think it's helpful to know what the readers are concerned about, to try to address that maybe in the next story. But once you take a phone call and they start insulting you personally, then I think that's where, I don't have to take the abuse.
And time for one final question over here.
I'm sorry for taking the mic again, since I just talked to you guys for an hour, but first of all, I learned a lot, and I can't wait to dig into your work, and clearly you are doing a lot of in-depth stuff and connecting the dots with history and everything, so I'm excited to learn more about that. But I just wanted to speak to your question about how, how do we support getting more of this out there, and I really think, I don't know how much people understand that you have a role to play in terms of telling the publications that you read, listen to, watch, tell them what you want. Because there's this narrative out there right now that everybody only wants the quick and cheap soundbite, and actually I'm really finding that's not true. But you have to convince editors and publishers of the publications that you value, that you want that, and then also understand that kind of in-depth reporting is so costly. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of depth from the reporter. Not every reporter can do it well, and so it's a big investment on the part of journalism organizations to do that. And I guess that kind of will lead me to my question, which is, did you have a hard time convincing your paper, to let you go, take the bus to Delaware and to do these in-depth projects? And how hard was it for you internally to get those projects supported?
I think with local newspapers, especially once they've worked with you and know the type of work you do, you earn their trust, and they know that they're sending you to Guatemala and you'll come back with something that's quality, that you're not just going to go there and then kind of wing it and then come back with a fluffy story. And I think, because, I mean, when you think of projects like this, you don't know who you're talking to necessarily. You don't know how people are going to react. You don't know what kind of challenges you're going to run into when you get there. And so you have to have plan A, B, C, D, and be flexible even after that, because, you know, you might start interviewing someone, and I dealt with the challenge of indigenous speakers, and you know, I started questioning people, and then right away I would realize that they were not really understanding my questions and the level that I needed to feel comfortable quoting them. And so by not having an indigenous native speaker, and then if you do get a translator, if it's someone from that community, well, they're not going to want to share certain things because it's from their same community, everyone knows everyone. So you deal with a lot of unknowns and unforeseen things that you just have to deal as you go with it. But I think as you build your reputation, both in the industry and with your individual editors, they're much more comfortable letting you undertake this sort of work. The challenge that I found with local media outlets, especially newspapers, is not so much the support of me doing the work, but the money to do it. And that's where groups such as this are so important, because otherwise, for a newspaper spending $10,000 on a story, plus your salary, plus your time, you know, they can't afford it.
Thank you so much to Perla, and for that final comment about everybody's agency in this. So please, a round of applause for the journalists.